Thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. I never thought I would have an Etsy shop, and now Etsy is one of my main sources of income. In this video, I'm going to invite you into my studio to make a new stencil for my Etsy shop. I make bullet journal stencils that help create mindful bullet journal spreads, or stencils that make basic bullet journal spreads quicker and easier to set up. So let's get straight to it. It's 9 AM and I've made myself a cup of coffee. I'm lighting one of my mindful candles before I start designing. Since I'll need to be switched on and alert for this, I tend to go for the awaken candle or strengthen. Now I'm ready to start working. When I have a stencil idea, I start by sketching it out on paper. What I love about creating stencils is that I'm thinking of ideas all the time while I'm journaling myself. The more I journal for myself, the more I get ideas for products that would help me and others. The stencil I'm designing today is one to help me set up spreads like this quickly and effortlessly. I want to draw up different size squares and rectangles to fill an A5 journal, and I want a range of pins, bulldog clips and tapes on the stencil to make it look like a bunch of notes all over the page. I wanted boxes big enough to write a decent amount in, so I started by drawing up squares that are 10 spaces up and 10 spaces across. I worked out that you can have 6 of these on one A5 page. Then I started thinking about different sizes and how they would fit on the A5 page if you mix and match them. That way you have a choice of different sizes based on how much you want to write, and the mix of different sizes creates a nice looking spread. Next, I need to design the stencil on my computer using an app called Fusion 360. It's completely free to use for hobbyists, and there's a paid professional version of it too. And it's amazing the kinds of things that you can make. Just look at this playlist full of all the things that you can design at home and print. For my stencil, I start by drawing a rectangle the size of my stencil. The dimensions of the stencil are limited by the 3D printers that I have, but luckily I can print stencils long enough and wide enough to fill an A5 journal. Next, I'm drawing up the 4 different sized boxes that I want on the stencil. Each space between dots in a bullet journal is 5mm, so I work out the dimensions by multiplying the number of spaces I want to cover by 5. The first box is 10 spaces by 10 spaces, which is 50mm by 50mm, but I also need to add an extra 2mm, making it 52 by 52, to account for the pen line that will be drawn when you're using the stencil. I save a version of the stencil before continuing because the next part might get a bit messy. I used a line drawing tool to start drawing the tabs, sticky tape and clips that I want on the stencil. This can get very fiddly, which you might not be able to see when the video is sped up. You can also draw images on your iPad and import them in, but so far for all of my stencils I've just needed the drawing tools in Fusion. I thought it'd be cool to have a paperclip on here so you can draw them consistently in your bullet journal, so I needed to refer to an image on Google to draw that one up. Finally, I used a mixture of shapes to create a drawing pin. I think these ones are called push pins. At this point I need to extrude. I highlight the stencil and deselect the parts that I don't want to extrude. So everything that's selected will be raised up. I raise it up by 1mm. It takes some adjusting to get yourself to think in this way, because when you look at a stencil, you think that the material has been cut out. But 3D printing is an additive process, so you have to get your brain thinking about where you want to add material. What I like about this is that you can just use your materials where you need them and there's no waste. If you use a cutting machine like a Cricut, for example, you start with more material than you need and then you cut away from it instead, and the cutouts could end up just becoming waste. Next up, I want to add some text to add a title for the stencil. This stencil is called Notes, since the theme is sticky notes and tabs. I extrude again, this time by 0.5mm. I deselect the letters to make sure that the stencil gets thicker around the letters. This will make it look like the text has been carved in. I save this as an STL file and call it my first attempt, because there are always modifications, which you'll see shortly. This file then gets dragged into a slicer, and I use one called Prusa Slicer. And in a slicer like this, you can see what your stencil looks like on the 3D printer plate and specify what materials you'll be using, the type of printer you have, and many other print settings. I use PLA, which is plastic, and it comes on a reel that feeds into the printer. If you're happy with the 3D model, you slice it and export it as G-code, and G-code is basically the language that 3D printers understand. I save the file on an SD card which gets inserted into the 3D printer. Printing is simple. Filament is loaded in the printer, and I just need to choose my file from the SD card. I save all of my stencils on the SD card so I can print anything I need at any time. The 3D printer heats up to 215 degrees, and once it's heated, it starts putting down layers of plastic in the shape of the 3D model I designed on the computer. Pretty cool, right? The 3D printer will keep putting down layers of plastic where I asked it to extrude, and it will lay down until it gets to 1.5 millimeters, which is what I specified in Fusion. It knows not to lay down plastic where I want the rectangles and pins cut out, because I deselected those when I extruded in Fusion, so it knows not to lay down any plastic there. Since this is the testing sample, I specified in the slicer tool that I wanted to make it thinner, so I waste less filament for testing, and it only takes 30 minutes to print. The final version after testing will be the full thickness of 1.5 millimeters. While that was printing, I took the opportunity to pack up some orders that had come through on Etsy. Once these are packaged up, I drop them off at the postbox on my way to pick up my kids from school and nursery at 3 o'clock. Before checking on the finished print, I'd like to take the opportunity to talk about the sponsor of this video, Skillshare. I first joined Skillshare when I started my YouTube channel in 2020. I realised there were so many classes that would help me grow my creative skills, which would help my channel and my newly found side hustle. The first class I ever took was Video Editing with Final Cut Pro by Ali Abdel. I really struggled with editing, but after taking this class, my videos transformed and it was less stressful and more enjoyable to make them. If you're interested, you can see the change in my video editing when you look at my August 2020 bullet journal setup video compared to my July 2020 setup video. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes and members across 150 countries. You can take classes on pretty much any creative subject, whether it's photography, art, or creative writing. And there are also lots of classes for self-care and personal growth, which I enjoy doing to get inspired and put my skills to work. The first 1,000 people to use the link in my description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Now it's time to test version 1 of the stencil. The boxes came out well, but the paperclip felt a bit flimsy. The testing stencil wasn't printed at full thickness, so I thought maybe that could be why. I decided that I wanted more space in between the boxes. This gives people the option to just lay down the stencil and draw the boxes as they are, rather than having to move it around and place it where they want them. The extra space would mean that the boxes fill up the page nicely, and it gives more space for the clips and tags in between the boxes. Back in Fusion, I doubled the size of the gap between boxes, which increased the height of the stencil overall. This meant the text wasn't in the right place anymore, and I find it very tricky to move and modify text in Fusion due to other constraints that are in place, so I had to just delete it and write it again. After extrusion and going back into the slicer, I printed version 2, this time at full thickness, to test. I was much happier with the spacing between boxes, but the paperclip still didn't feel sturdy enough, even with the stencil printed at full thickness. I also wanted to see if I can make all of the clips and tags a bit smaller. I made the changes in Fusion and put the third version through the slicer again. Here's version 3. You'll notice on the paperclip I added some extra blocks within the lines to make it more sturdy. This means there'll be a gap in parts of the paperclip that need to be filled in by hand, but I found that it really helped keep the paperclip in place. The gap for drawing the paperclip is quite small, so it fits a thin fine liner or pencil. I didn't want to make it any wider because it would make the paperclip look too wide and strange, so I kept it as it is because at least you have the option of using it with a thin pen or a pencil, which you can then just draw over. I was happy with the stencil overall and thought I would make some different types of spreads with it to make sure it's easy to use. The first spread I tried was the easiest for people who want to just put the stencil down and draw all of the boxes as they are without moving the stencil. I experimented with making a double page layout by flipping the stencil over on the right hand page. Having the layout reversed on the second page just makes the double page spread look a bit more interesting. Next, I tested what it would be like to mix and match the boxes on the stencil instead of leaving it in one place. This was easy to do, so you can choose which boxes you need on the page and just use those. I played around with different types of hand-drawn additions that you can make on the boxes and thought this would be a helpful thing to share as well. There are so many different ways you can decorate the boxes, and I could already see how fun and easy it will be to create spreads with the stencil. When using a stencil for the first time, you can mark off a few lines in pencil first until you're comfortable with using it. For one last test, I thought I'd just randomly move the stencil around the page with no plan at all. Just drawing boxes at random places all over a double page. It ended up turning into a weekly spread. It was good to know that you can create pretty and useful spreads without any thought at all, which is usually something I always want my stencils to offer people. I'm curious, do you like to use stencils in your bullet journal? Would you use this one? Let me know in the comments below. So that's the final stencil. It's time to take photos of it and create a listing on Etsy so other people can buy it if they think it will be useful for them. It takes 1 hour to print, so I tried to print off a batch before publishing the listing, and then I can start fulfilling orders right away. By the time this video is published, the stencil will be on Etsy, so feel free to grab one for yourself if you're interested in using it in your bullet journal. Let me know if you enjoyed this video and whether you have any questions about the process, and if you'd like to see more content on running my Etsy shop or on creating a side hustle. I'm happy to share as much as you'd like. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.